the history of Scotch, what is a single malt Scotch, how it's made, the whole production process, and a little bit of probably the most important part of the industry today, and that's the maturation process, all the different kinds of oaks that we're using and the combination of all that oak. Okay, so you guys ready to go? Yeah! Okay, so what is a single malt Scotch whiskey? A single malt Scotch is a whiskey made in Scotland from 3 ingredients: water, barley, and yeast. That's the only 3 things that are in there. It must be matured for at least 3 years, although if you taste the whiskey at 3 years old, it's not the most desirable whiskey, so we let it go a little longer. And at Glenlivet, our youngest is 12. Has to be mature, has to be distilled at a certain strength, and it has to be bottled at a certain strength. And again, has to be made in Scotland. A Scotch whiskey, a Scotch is a whiskey. Every Scotch is a whiskey. Not every whiskey is a Scotch. Okay, so you've got Irish whiskies, bourbons. Japanese are making very good whiskies now, but it cannot be Scotch whiskey because it was not made in Scotch, and all the other parameters I talked about earlier. Just as champagne is a sparkling wine, but can only be champagne if it's from the Champagne region. Okay, that gives you an idea. Okay, so the 12-year-old, the first one we're going to start with, which is the one on your extreme left, Speyside whiskey, matured all in American oak, used bourbon cask, and has a very, very fruity, floral, vanilla, honey flavored essence to it. It's a very easy whiskey. Most of the Speysides are. Out of the 98 or 100 or so distilleries in Scotland, more than half of them are in the Speyside region. Okay, because it produces a very elegant, very sweet whiskey. The best way to enjoy a single malt Scotch is actually to add just a little bit of water to it. When you add the water to it, it breaks the surface tension of the spirit. We're going to get real religious in here today, okay? So you break the surface tension of the whiskey and let that pure ethanol evaporate off. Because if you don't do that, that ethanol hits your palate and your olfactory, and it numbs you just slightly, just enough to where you'll miss out on some of the nuances and some of the flavors that the whiskey has to offer. Now, the best way to drink a single malt is not in a plastic cup, obviously, right? So the best way to drink it is actually in a straw right at the bottle and just walk around the fairground like. Well, we'll leave that for the others. So obviously we're not going to get everything that we could get from the whiskey today at the plastic cup, but just bear with me. More of the aromas you won't get, but you will get the taste on the palate, okay? So you should have seen in the 12, very easy, very soft. There is a little bit of a harsh element to it because 12-year-old, believe it or not, is still young for a whiskey. But overall, very balanced, a very nice whiskey. Slanja. Hopefully I'll get through this whole tasting without passing out. You guys definitely get a lot prettier the more I drink, so I'm just going to keep going. Okay, so a little bit of a history lesson for you. Scotch whiskey first started showing up, or first started being made around the late 1400s. Friar John Carr at that time had ordered on the Exchequer had ordered about 8 balls of malt, which would have produced about 1,500 litres of spirit. So even by 1400s, the late 1400s, it was being made on quite a scale. The only thing about drinking a whiskey in the late 1400s is one of 2 things happened. You either got really drunk and had a great time with your friends, or you died. Okay? We had not quite refined the process yet. So over the next couple of centuries, the monks who had been driven from the monasteries actually took up the art of distillation. And the 1600s and the 1700s started to produce some really, really nice whiskies. Okay? By the late 1700s and early 1800s, the government had imposed such a heavy tax, damn English, has imposed such a heavy tax on the whiskey that we couldn't really make it at an affordable rate. And we were making whiskey not really to sell it anyway, but we're using it for barter for food and clothing and stuff like that. So most of the whiskey that was being made in the early 1800s was illegal. It was a very illegal smuggling industry that came up from that. And it wasn't until 1823 when the government actually passed the excise law and made it a lot more affordable to make whiskey legally. And in 1824, the age statement that's on every bottle of Glenlivet, George Smith, the founder, whose family had been making whiskey for generations, applied for and got the first license to produce whiskey legally. Okay, so it's the first legal whiskey as of 1824. Do you want to taste a little? No, I'll hold off for a second. Okay, just a little more history going through Glenlivet. 1859, we changed location of the distillery because we reached maximum capacity, but we didn't go far. We stayed very close to the original water source. So again, the whiskey you drink today, same water source as it was 200 years ago. So in 1859, we built a new distillery. At the early part of the 20th century, when the Dark Ages kind of kicked in the United States, Prohibition, Glenlivet actually had made a lot of good whiskey throughout World War I and World War II, one of the only distilleries to stay open. So we had a lot of good single malt ready to come over in 1933 when Prohibition was lifted. So when we came to the States in 33, we were number one then, and today we're still the number one single malt in the USA. We just actually opened a new part of the distillery in May of this year. We reached maximum capacity again last year at 6 million litres a year. Okay? Big thanks to this table right here. They drank most of it. And we actually just increased our capacity by 75%. So now we can make 10.5 million litres a year. So drink up, guys. And big point in my career, actually Prince Charles came up there and cut the ribbon. I got to meet him, so it was really cool. So we'll drink to that. Okay, so the 15-year-old you're about to taste. Again, add just a splash of water to it. For the first 12 years, the whiskey in this bottle spent all of its time in the American oak used bourbon cask. At 12 years old, we extracted 30% from the cask. We put it in French Limousin oak, okay, which was a virgin oak. It's the only time we used virgin oak. There was no cognacs, brandies, or armagnacs in there. So it's the only time we used fresh oak. And what happened when we put the whiskey in that French oak is, French oak is a little softer and it's a little more porous, just like the French, a little softer. I said that last time. There's no French people in here, is there? Irish? Any Irish people? I'm going to get them too. I'm going to get you guys a little bit. Okay. English people, I don't care if you're in here or not. I'm talking bad about you anyway. So what that French oak influence did was actually soften the whiskey a little bit. And you'll find with a 15 that it's very soft and very creamy and very buttery. Much more approachable on the palate even than our 12. Very, very easy whiskey. It's our fastest growing whiskey. People who are just getting into single malts, instead of going through traditionally our young 12-year-old, they're coming in through the 15. They really like the 15. Ladies, you guys love the 15, okay? First time I ever realized that was in Charleston, South Carolina about 4 years ago. There was a lady come up to me at the tasting and said, I don't drink whiskey, I'm only here because my husband signed me up. 30 minutes later, she had her high heels in one hand and this bottle in the other, and she was standing around the whole room telling everybody that it was her favorite whiskey. And since then, it's always a big favorite with the ladies. So, okay, so before we move on, I'll talk a little bit about the production process and how we actually make the whiskey. I mentioned earlier, water, barley, and yeast. That's the only three ingredients that are in that whiskey, okay? Our water source is Josie's well. It's an underground well. Has been the same water source again for generations and for centuries. Very consistent temperature throughout the year, about 3 to 8 degrees Celsius, which means we're working with a consistent product. And if anybody's ever been to Scotland, you know that's the temperature of Scotland about all year long, 3 to 8 degrees Celsius. And people do ask me when the summer is in Scotland, and I tell them August 17th. If you don't go August 17th, you miss the summer, okay? So the water source consistent, also mineral rich. That part of Scotland's on a granite rock, so that water filters through that granite, and it's full of sulfates, nitrates, calciums, and when it comes to distillation, they're very desirable elements that really give a little sweetness to our whiskey through the distillation process. The barley that we use mainly for yield purpose, no real flavor coming from the barley. And the yeast that we use, again, just yield purpose, maximum conversion of sugar to alcohol during fermentation, okay? Okay, so the first thing we do is we malt the barley. We do that by soaking it in water. We drain the water off. We let the barley sit in its own damp conditions, and it starts to convert the starch in its grain to a soluble sugar called a maltose sugar. That's where we get the word malt from. When that reaches maximum germination, we dry it out and we capture it. So we just change the grain from starch to soluble sugar. We grind it up, we add water, we leave it sitting, we separate the water one more time. Only this time the water has captured all of the sugar. So we have sugar water here and just the solid here, and the solid goes off. It's used for animal feed. It's a very green industry. Very little waste in production. Very little waste in consumption, but very little waste in production also. So we have sugar water at this point. Then we add our yeast. And we add the yeast. After about 50 to 54 hours, that yeast consumes the sugar in itself and converts it to alcohol, carbon dioxide, and heat. The heat dissipates, the carbon dioxide evaporates, and we're left with a beer of about 8% alcohol by volume. So at one point, this was a beer. We then take that beer and we boil it in our copper pot still. We distill it. And all that is a huge copper pot still with a bulbous base and a cone top. We boil the beer in there, and the first things to evaporate off of there are pure alcohols and fusols. They rise in the chamber, they cool, they condense, and they're now a refined liquid, and it looks like this. Moonshine, White Dog,